Okay,
It
Rick.
was, it's the beginning of my career. It's 1990, and I had just come off of the Adams County airport election in '88, and then we had to redo that election in Denver in '89. And so getting tagged to do this was pretty cool, and right after the Denver campaign in '89. And the committee had been trying to do everything bipartisan. And so they had like two co-chairs for the campaign side of that. They had Chris Paulson and they had Odell Berry. And Odell I had known from kind of Democratic politics before. Chris Paulson was a guy I'd really not known before. He was a Republican. He'd been in leadership in the caucus. He had represented Inglewood. That's kind of during my college days. So as an active Democrat, I thought he was like evil and the devil. It was kind of, it was really kind of funny. When I met him, I was like, oh my goodness, you're, you know.
That's what he looks like.
You're nice. That's what he looks like. Exactly. That's exactly right. And he was very active in that, where I was working very closely with him and just kind of operational stuff. And so that started a career of he and I did a campaign together in '94.
Wow.
We did another one in '96. We did another one in 2000. And so my relationship with Chris Paulson and just kind of doing a lot of professional campaign stuff,
Wow.
it was born out of that. That's when I met Joe Blake. In 1990, he was one of the officers or something of the baseball commission, and that's when I first met Joe. Just kind of, you know, one of the most lovely human beings you'll ever meet in your life. And I remember on election night, we were upstairs in the hotel, and we had a full bar set up, and people were coming up to the room and stuff. But we had a stage set up downstairs. And I was too scared to go downstairs because I didn't know what the outcome was going to be. And it was massive. We'd set up this huge stage and this big backdrop. It was in a ballroom for a couple thousand people. The thing was starting to fill up, and I was starting to flip out. Joe was like, "You'll be fine, you'll be fine. Just sit up here for a while." And we were waiting for Boulder to come through, which was taking forever. But so Joe became a 30-year relationship. And
Wow.
He went from Mission Viejo over to the Chamber, and from the Chamber he went up to CSU. And my horse has been tied to his barn for a long, long time. So that was, they were just, those were two relationships that came out of that were significant to my career. Walt Klein, who did the media for that campaign, had started with me and John Frew in the airport election 2 years prior, in 1988, when we were doing the Adams County side. Since then, since 1988, we're going on what will be 30 years the next election cycle. And Walt's been my media consultant ever since then for
Isn't
a
that
28-year career in ballot issues. So a lot of good stuff for me professionally came out of that effort. Campaigns, political issues are frequently all about timing. And good things can happen, but if it's at the wrong time, it's just not meant to be. And for whatever reasons that these things happened, as magical as they are, a couple critical things had happened. And one of them was that you guys had the foresight to make sure that the ballot language made it clear that if we don't get a team, then we don't build the stadium. And so that just kind of told voters right off the bat kind of the no risk downside of it that they could see right there on the ballot. The second thing is that it was scheduled for a primary election. And in Colorado at that time, we held our primaries in the middle of August. And it was really a time when people weren't really used to voting. It wasn't that active a primary that year. But the 6-county polls in the metro area made it clear that the population was not for raising the sales tax in order to go build the stadium. And so if the election was representative of the population, there was no way we were going to get home. And so holding it at the primary changed the dynamics. So because a primary wasn't representative of the population, it was representative of active Republicans and active Democrats. And then out of the unaffiliated, they really didn't participate in primary elections in Colorado back in 1990. That just wasn't part of their behavior. And so when it was all done, through Walt's contribution largely to this, we had figured out that with a very low turnout and kind of a turnout that wasn't proportional to what the population was thinking, that we had an opportunity here with unaffiliated voters who largely would stay home because they don't vote in Democratic Republican primaries. And we started to mold a file of people who were baseball supporters. And then we ran that file against the registered voter file of unaffiliateds, and then started working those people in the last 2 weeks to turn out and vote. Because back in 1990, there really wasn't an absentee ballot, mail ballot dynamic to the election. You had to show up at a polling place unless you could claim that you were sick or going to be out of town. Otherwise, you had to show up. And so the first order of business was to just find people who were for baseball. And then after we made that list, then we ran that against the registered voter file. And if it kicked out unaffiliated voters who were for baseball, then we were just turning them out en masse. We weren't even calling them and asking them. We were just sending them tons of mail, trying to get them to take responsibility for bringing Major League Baseball to Denver. And so the way that we did this was twofold. Walt went out, and this is before computers, really. I mean, we were really using...
You think of trying to do anything today without a computer.
Exactly. And so we were going out and buying mail lists of like, what would that be? Outdoor... Was that
Outdoor Magazine?
Outdoor Magazine, Field and Stream, fishing books, anything that was sports related, that we would go and buy those mailing lists. Anything that we could get that was on a mailing list for a sporting goods store that we could purchase. Anything that was kind of related, any Little League kind of membership directories that we could find. We were grabbing any and all of these, like all over Colorado. And then the second thing that we came up with, which is really kind of clever, I haven't used this since then, was what we called the ironing board brigade. And we would literally take an ironing board, which would easily fit into your car, and that we would show up at Little League games, football games, outside a stadium for any soccer event, lacrosse event, whatever it was. We'd pop open this ironing board and flip over a tape sign that said, you know, sign up here for Major League Baseball. And we had a sign-up thing that said, yes, I support bringing Major League Baseball to Colorado. And we had tens of thousands of these. We worked every parade. We worked everything in the summer that we possibly could that was an outdoor kind of venue. And we took all these slips and had them all entered into the database and added to that all of these mailing lists from these sports magazines and print kind of formats, and loaded all that up and ran it against the registered voter file. And that's what we ended up turning out as just blind turnout for the last 2 weeks of that election. I remember that piece very clearly. That was a clever piece to do, and it would have only worked in a primary election. Because if you had 15,000 Republicans showing up and 12,000 Democrats, you really only needed about 8,000 unaffiliated to kind of play this. Keep in mind there were 80,000 unaffiliated at the time, so we were only really looking for 10% of what was out there, and we're able to cobble together by election day really an unrepresentative sample that was for something that the population as a whole was still quite not convinced that that's what they wanted to do. The second thing, I had a second thing that I had thought about last night that was kind of related to that, but it'll come back to me in a second.
Did you do any advertising? Did you have enough
We
money
did.
for that?
limited advertising. When it was all said and done, we had raised a paltry amount of money, but we had raised $600,000. And the only reason that that was even possible is that about 2 months before the election, 2.5 months before the election, there was an article in the Rocky Mountain News, a paper that's not around anymore, and it was about a meeting that the baseball commission had had, because they held regular meetings. It seemed like every other week, not once a month. And in this article, they were talking about the discussion at the baseball commissioners meeting that there wasn't anybody contributing any money whatsoever, and that if people didn't change their tone, then we weren't going to be able to bring Major League Baseball to Denver. And this was, to someone who was reading that in the newspaper, they might have just thought, oh, you know, the cynic in them, what kind of. But you have to remember that people who were around baseball at that time were not just people who were on the Colorado Baseball Commission. There had been baseball commissions in Colorado. There had been a Denver Baseball Commission even prior to that. People had been working for almost a couple decades to try and find a way to bring Major League Baseball to Denver, as you know. And so this was a comment made out of frustration at a board meeting. Well, who read it? Bill Daniels. Bill Daniels reads this in the newspaper, and one day we go to the mailbox at our office, and there is an envelope hand addressed to the campaign, and it's from Bill Daniels, and it's a check for $100,000. I mean,
You thought you'd won the lotto.
because he had seen it in the newspaper, and he had clipped it out, and he had attached it to the check, and the check in that article had come in an envelope. And it was just, I remember Mary Alice Mandrich was our fundraiser, and opened it up, and we're just sitting there going, this is crazy. But it was the impetus to raise another $500,000 because we now had some seed money. It was unbelievable. We ended up doing about 6 days of television because that's all we were going to be able to buy. And we didn't really want to buy it because you don't really buy television back then in 1990 to talk to such a limited number of people who were going to participate in the election. Denver media market was just too large to justify using that medium. But we sent a lot of mail. And we probably sent even less mail to Democrats and Republicans as we had sent to everybody that we had picked up in this ironing board brigade, because those were people who said that they were for it. We know that there wasn't really any motivation really to get them turned out as long as they knew when the election was and where they needed to show up and vote. And so we were able to send a lot of mail to them that said, here's your polling place, here's the time that you can do this, you got to take responsibility for that. So that Bill Daniels check, though, was another one of those critical moments that you all have been inventorying through this project, where you find out there's a little bead of activity there that could have been a tipping point. And I believe that they could have just as easily named that Bill Daniels Stadium. That was how significant that piece was. The other part of this, and I always felt sorry for him, is Floyd Cerulli was the preeminent pollster at that time in Colorado, and for almost any kind of political issue. And the Post, I think, had kept hiring him to do polls for the newspaper to kind of track it. Both papers were crazy about passing this thing. They would have done anything to try and get this over the hill. So they were writing stuff all the time. We were always doing interviews with the sports department. We were doing interviews with the editorial page. We were doing interviews with the business department. I mean, every segment of the paper except for the section on comics was writing something about this. It seems like every day it was a policy of both papers to make sure that they had something in there. And I remember at that time that they were getting Floyd to do these polls, and Floyd was polling as best as he could what was a representative sample of the metro area, the 6 county metro area, which overlaps with RTD at that time. And he kept coming back with numbers that were really frustrating. 58-42, this thing really had no shot of passing. we're 2.5 months out from election. You're trying to develop a lot of energy to get going. And then this article would show up in both papers about, this is never going to happen. It's highly controversial. It's just not going to be there. And to his credit, it would have been very difficult in 1990 to predict a ballot issue that everybody was allowed to vote on at an election that was really only called for Democrats and Republicans. It's the only election I remember in Colorado at a primary where there was also a ballot issue on the ballot that anybody could vote on. So it was a very unique circumstance that actually played into our favor. So, I think that kind of contributed to, as we got closer and closer to Election Day, the only real information that we had to go on was the information in our own voter files, which said to us that we had found enough names matched against the voter file to win. But the only public information that we really had was the poll that Cerulli had been doing of the community as a whole. And again, we get to election night, you're never really sure what's going to happen. And as those slow votes start coming in, places like Douglas and Arapahoe and Jefferson are, huge in your favor. And places like Denver and Adams County and Boulder, were considerably tougher.
Did you do any polling at all?
No, we didn't do any polling. We didn't have any money. We didn't have any money for anything until the $100,000 check showed up from Daniels. And again, we're 60 days out from Election Day. We really had nothing to work with. The state of Colorado was constantly looking for, the Baseball Commission was constantly looking for help that they couldn't get from the state of Colorado, even though the legislature had played a role in creating this commission. They did it under the condition that they weren't going to give them any money. And so now this Baseball Commission, once again, which they had done on multiple occasions in the previous 2 decades of creating different iterations of a Colorado Baseball Commission, really had little to work with. To just give you a sense of how significant that was, I think that by the time the election was over, this was a project that I think we had bid for maybe $100,000, and we had been paid $4. And so now the election's over, we're sitting around, we're like, okay, I just spent 5 months of all my clientele working on this thing, and I have some people to pay, and I need to get paid. And there was really no one to pay the bill because we didn't have a team. All we had was a campaign committee and a baseball commission who couldn't even raise money for the things that they were working on. Right. They couldn't even finance, and it was a rough time business-wise. But I remember 2 people who really went to bat here. One of them was John McHale, who called up Paul Jacobs and said, after we got an ownership, when that first ownership team started to come together, John got on the phone with Paul Jacobs, who was their attorney, and says, we got to pay these guys. They did what we asked them to do, and they're really, they're a large part of, as a lot of other pieces as to why we're even, in this conversation right now. You guys need to take some responsibility for that. And Paul went and made that, to his credit, went and made that argument to those initial guys in that ownership group. And lo and behold, that was the second check that showed up of great surprise and activity. The first being the one for the campaign from Bill Daniels, and the second one coming from that Rockies ownership group.
So did you end up getting paid in full?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's great.
It was really great. It was, to this day, I still have John McHale's business card in my wallet. It's kind of, how you have to separate your credit cards or they demagnify, and one of my separators is John McHale's the business card from when he was the attorney.
I'm going out to New York in 3 weeks and interview him. I'm
Really?
going to be out there for another reason.
Please tell him I said hello.
Okay, definitely will.
Please tell him that you were in a meeting with Rick Reiter doing this, and he opened up his wallet and pulled out a John McHale. No, that would have been, we have all kinds of old mementos in here. He's in here. I know he's in here. Here's Cole Fettigood when he was city attorney. And there's John McHale when he was a Rocky. Isn't that funny? And then, I probably haven't seen him in 10 years.
Well, I hear he's
But-
what, number 3 in
He's like
baseball?
number 3 in baseball.
Is he really?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Well, good for him.
He's
He-
done well for
He was
himself.
always a smart guy. He was a brilliant guy, and he was always one of our biggest cheerleaders in the campaign, and certainly the biggest cheerleader afterwards.
So it seems to me that there was a lot of free media. I mean, that's all the newspapers wanted to write about, and it's all that talk radio wanted to talk about at that time. Was that free media, you think, was help, or do you think it was somewhat negative because there were some people indicating this is a football town and we don't need no stinking baseball?
I always think that if you have a measure on the ballot that's of merit, then you want a lot of conversation, you want a lot of dialogue, you want a lot of discussion, because we find out so frequently in these measures that the people on the edges, your harshest critics, will tend to deviate from the truth to get to emotion, to kind of rabbit that up, and you need a lot of dialogue so that people can kind of filter through all this stuff and sit back and go, yeah, I don't know, I think that's kind of probably an overstatement. And so I thought it was afterwards, as I grew into my career, I value those things. At the time, it was driving me crazy because there was a talk show with 2 guys. I can't even remember their name today, but if I heard it, I remember exactly who they were. And they were constantly badgering about
Gary
it.
Smith,
Drew, whatever, and it was
Yeah.
constantly bantering about this thing, and the tax is too high, Denver can't support it, you can't have a ball at 52, 80 feet, blah, 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 they'll fold within 6 years, it's kind of, it's just anything that they could possibly think of, they came up. Well, I was used to all this because I heard it all in the airport campaign 2 years before. It was just kind of all the same junk, and so it would drive you a little crazy. But part of being in a campaign is being very focused, and you come up with a very limited number of things to do, and go do them very well. When you have a whole lot of people on the outside, and you had a big commission, it seemed to me like you had 20 people. And they were calling every day, sometimes twice a day, saying, well, I think you got to do this. And you just had to filter all that out and stick to your 3 things and shake your head and go, you bet, I think that's right. And, probably have the conversation again the next day. But it's not about doing a lot of things not very well. It's about doing a limited number of things extremely well. And I think what we did extremely well was to go out and canvass the 6-county metro area for people who wanted baseball. And then after we got their names and addresses, we're able to run it against a file of people who were registered to vote, so that we had the combination of registered voters who wanted baseball, who almost definitely were not going to vote in a primary election, except for this one reason, which was something they wanted was actually on the ballot.
Well, I remember one particular day on talk radio, Peter Boyle was telling the world that
He was a rough guy.
this was a big scam, and because unaffiliateds were not going to be able to vote, and he had a constitutional attorney who had given him that reliable information.
I had a lot of campaigns after that, and Peter Boyles had a show for a long time after that, and I would always go on his show, and we would always banter back and forth on this, and he was always a lively personality about that. And I remember during that campaign, I probably wanted to strangle him, and as I spent much more time with him over the years, it was pretty funny because we always had, he had a job to do, and he was supposed to be the critic, and he did it very well, and probably kept us more honest and being more factual about really what this was. It's funny, Colorado voters are skeptical about tax increases, and this is before Doug Bruce came in with Tabor and stuff. They've always been skeptical about tax increases, and it's in this situation, they were very skeptical about the idea of raising a tax. In the baseball commission and you, Kathy, down at the legislature had to deal with this, which is they wanted safeguards. They wanted to kind of nail this stuff down as to what was the public paying for, what was the company paying for, how much risk were we exposed to, what happens if Major League doesn't give us a team. All these things had to almost be addressed, and so I like it. better when these issues get referred by the government onto the ballot than they do by standing up in front of grocery stores with petitions and petitioning on the ballot, because that legislative process requires a vetting where you have to answer a lot of questions in the public domain, under public scrutiny, in front of the newspapers, in two houses, first in a committee and then on the floor, so that if you don't have your stuff together, you're going to get called out for it. And so that strengthened the whole ability to take this to the voters in the first place, because it had already gone through a very healthy vetting down at the state legislature.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, and I think, we changed some significant pieces in the legislation because of criticism that we heard from one place or another. Certainly, the suburban counties saying Denver, this is just something to enrich Denver, we're all going to pay for it, and Denver's going to be the only one to get the benefit. And we decided to put revenue sharing into the bill because of that. One of the other things that I wanted to ask you is, I know Z. Ferrafino, who was on the baseball commission, felt that the Hispanic vote was a major block because they were big baseball supporters. Did you see that in the campaign, or?
I think Z had a pretty strong point at that time, and that's applied even more so as Colorado's population has grown, and particularly in the metro area, in Denver, Adams County, Aurora specifically. So his point is valid. At the time, we didn't really have the computer technology in order to take advantage of that then like we do today. What we were interested in is, if you're a baseball supporter, we need your name and address. That's all we really cared about. And for 2 months, we pretty much went through every corner of the metro area that we could find. So whether it was a Cinco de Mayo events, or whether it was a Little League baseball tournament over at Holly Hills at Southeast Denver Baseball, or whether it was a high school stadium that was playing a summer soccer thing, it didn't really matter to us where you kind of fit in, mostly as a Democrat or Republican, Hispanic, anything. If you were a baseball supporter, we needed your name and address. And once we had collected literally tens of thousands of those, then we ran them against the voter file. And I remember when we finished doing this, we had something like 110,000 of these cards of people we had picked up their names from the Ironing Board Brigade, and the names that had come off of these subscription lists of kind of these sports-related magazines. When we were all done, there was like 110,000 to start with. When we ran it against the file, only about 11 or 12,000 kicked out. I mean, that was depressing about how much work had gone into building this up, thinking we had figured out the smarter mousetrap, and that only about 11,000 of these had added up as unaffiliated voters who were for baseball, wanted to bring Major League Baseball to Colorado. But out of 11,000, if you only needed 4,000 of them to vote, and you got 6,000 of them to vote, not only did you win, you won with a little margin, and we won with a little bit of margin. So even though the theory was only, almost 10%, it paid off remarkably for the big picture.
So if we go back in time to where things were in history, certainly the Denver metro area was in a pretty deep recession at that time. We were looking at building an airport. We were looking at building the Denver Public Library. The cultural facilities tax had just passed.
That's correct.
Knowing as sophisticated politically as you are now compared to way back then, do you think you would have taken on the issue knowing all of those things were looming ahead of you?
Well, it's a good question. We were, by 90, we were just coming out of it. I think most people would acknowledge now, 10 years after that recession, that it probably peaked right about 88. It is without question the driving reason that we have this new airport in 1988. why it won in Adams County, why it won in Denver. Because on election day, there were 7,200 people who showed up to work as volunteers on election day, which is a remarkable number of people. And they weren't campaign volunteers, really. They were bankers and real estate agents and people who were at the bottom of that economy in '88. So by the time this came around in '90, it was actually probably a good time because we were starting to make some investments here, and people were starting to understand that we're going to start putting some money into the system because this recession was, kind of, we got to spread things out a little bit. We're so engaged in oil and gas that every time oil and gas had a boom and bust cycle, then Colorado would have a boom and bust cycle. And we were looking for ways to our culture was trying to look for ways to kind of broaden out from that. So maybe that was more of a help than a hindrance.
So I know that Neil had brought me an economic development study when he talked to me about the bill. Was that beneficial to you all, talking about the economic benefit, or do you think it was more of the excitement and romance of having baseball and being having all 4 major sports here?
Well, I think everybody who was supportive of bringing Major League Baseball to Colorado, it was a visceral effect. They wanted baseball. Everything else was kind of supportive to that, subordinate to that, and secondary, but it was supportive. And part of what we really needed were material, because we were in front of the working press every day, from radio to TV to newspapers. They were knocking on our door, and it wasn't just the news department, it was everybody. And so you needed material, you needed stuff to talk about. It kind of the economic study was very important to us in order to, because you just couldn't sit there in front of the camera and say, well, if you want Major League Baseball, come to Colorado, vote yes. You need a little more depth to that. But at the end of the day, that's why those things win and lose. Think about this. And I think it's instructive. I remember when Pat Bowlen first came up with the idea that we needed a new Bronco Stadium. And they were howling at him. That was ugly. And I remember we went and did a poll for that. And it was sitting at about 60-40 against a month or two after he had first proposed the idea. Do you realize that went to the legislature 3 consecutive sessions before it finally ended up on the ballot? He almost was going to have it on the ballot the first year. Then they kind of pulled back on that idea. They didn't have everything kind of lined up. Then it went back to the legislature, and they got pretty close to putting it on the ballot again, and then he decided, no, it's not, the numbers weren't quite right again, and then they go through the legislature a third time and win the Super Bowl. But people needed time to kind of get comfortable with the idea that we were going to raise our taxes for a sports facility for a team that we loved. I mean, we had them here, we loved, and even that was somewhat of a climb until, they got to the election, which would have been the year that they won the Super Bowl, so they had like a little bit of bonus. We really didn't have that. We were kind of working behind that. Again, had it not been a primary election, we would not have won that year. We might have won in a subsequent year, but we were not ready in that cycle of the economy, and at that point of where we were, the electorate in the 6-county metro area was not supportive of raising a sales tax for a new baseball stadium.
But it had to be done right then, because
That's when
the expansion
team was coming
happening. And if we had missed that window,
We missed a long time.
The window would have been several years down the road.
Well, and that was too, it seemed like it was forever and ever before Major League Baseball said they were going to expand. I mean, I think part of the story that people don't know or understand is that Tim Wirth and Dan Schaefer decided to hold some antitrust hearings for baseball.
Right.
And, kind of helped them have a vision.
Another piece in the tipping point.
Right.
That
right.
kind of, they were a jagged peak we had to get over in a mountain of jagged peaks.
Right.
That each one was a significant step in leading to the next. I remember that. I remember when they did that. I remember that it had a very tangible impact on
Well,
Major League Baseball.
You know, they just kept dragging their feet and dragging their feet even after they made the announcement, you know, enough so that it seemed like every city and their brother got engaged in, yeah, we're going to put in our application to have a team. Then, all of a sudden, and we're thinking, okay, we'll put it on the general election ballot, then they move up the timetable and say, we're going to make a decision before that November election, and so
Right.
we have to move it
We
up.
have to go now.
Yes. And
Yeah, it's not, we didn't back into that decision intentionally to hold the election at the primary. It was forced upon us.
but
And
fortuitous.
sometimes there's an invisible helping hand out there
Yeah.
that in Denver's kind of cycle of its history of up and downs, that was a pretty significant cycle for Denver. Was the airport, the stadium, the convention center, all of that, because in the end, it reinvented Denver as a city almost 3 times, that had us kind of survive successive recessions better than anybody else. Redeveloping, Denver International Airport itself is almost half the size of the city. And so it's a city of itself. And so all of that activity going on for almost 12 years was a recreation of Denver. Then we go over and we redevelop where the old airport was at Stapleton, and that kind of recreated a third Denver. And then the redevelopment of Lowry was our fourth Denver, and then the redevelopment of the Platte Valley was our fifth Denver. All of those 4 happened in a 30-year window. And it was a matter of activity, economic activity, that really allowed Denver to be in its place today, which is amongst 50 states, it's the economic leader. And amongst places where people are moving around the nation and want to live, we're the #1 desirable place. We've got a beautiful place here. We've got all the amenities that a big place would have. We've got a fantastic economy. We've got a great education system. And we've kind of been pretty steady about this since 1988, as opposed to other places in the country that have followed the national economic cycles, where they've kind of had higher highs and lower lows. We've been pretty steady along the way without having to dip too low or get too full of ourselves.
You have some questions, Neil?
I think we've covered it pretty well. That's really good, right?
I think I have just one other question. There were some other things that we put in the legislation that it would be helpful to know if you think that it was helpful in the election or that it, at the end of the day, didn't make any difference. And one of those was that the bonds would go away as soon as the stadium was paid for. And we at that time didn't know what the stadium was going to cost. We just had to make a guess. And at that time, I think we were guessing 20 years.
All right.
Because of where we were within the recessionary
Right,
cycle where
right.
we were.
Based on the sales tax revenue in the metro
Right,
area.
right. And so just to say that 20 years or whenever the bonds are retired. The other thing that we had put in was this goal of privatization, that the stadium authority had to go out and sell the naming rights and the parking revenue and the advertising revenue in order to help retire the debt
Correct.
sooner. And certainly we aren't going to build a stadium until we're awarded a team. Do you think those had an impact on the ballot issue, or do you think that was secondary to the excitement of having baseball?
Well, not only do I think they were significant to the outcome of the election, but they have really been the principles now that have applied to Colorado fiscal issues that are brought before the public for a public vote since the passage of Tabor in 1992. If you go back and look at the 1996 legislation that created the first ballot language for redoing the Bronco Stadium, and you look at the light rail measure as it was passed through the legislature and the authorization for them to hold that election, you're going to see parallels between accountability segments that were embedded into those pieces of legislation, that the Pathfinder goes back to 1990 and the legislative authorization to put this on the ballot. Again, we're a skeptical state when it comes to voting on tax issues. That's what we are, and so we want a level of transparency. We need almost feel-good language in there that makes us, sense that people are sensitive to our fact that maybe we don't really trust government, or maybe we like some of the people in government, but they're always messing stuff up. And so if the government's for this, then it's probably going to get messed up. And so we have to put these accountability measures in there. If you look at many of these school bond issues that are passing in the 177 school districts across the state today, these Title 32 ballot measures that deal with fire stations and rural hospitals and all of them, they all are coming back and embedding into their legislation stuff that the legislature, best practices that they had utilized in 1990 to put this issue onto the 6-county regional area. So not only was it important then, but it's got longevity.
That's
Well,
great.
anything else
That's
you want
great.
to add
Anything
that
to
we
add?
haven't talked about? Did we pique your
I remember
imagination?
little things that came out of this is I remember McHale had called me 2 days before opening day at Mile High Stadium and said, "You're taken care of, right?" I was like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "You're going to the game on Thursday or Friday, whatever it was." And I was like, "Nah, I didn't." He's like, "Yes, you are." And so he messengers over 2 tickets that are, they put 3 rows on the field over next to the first base dugout. And so my wife and I got to sit there and
Great.
watch Eric Young belt this thing over the
first
and
pitch.
I thought I was like cheering at a Bronco game. It was so politically incorrect for a Major League Baseball game. But that piece was really cool. I remember that my sister and her husband and 2 kids, my nephews, had come here the next year to a Texas Rangers game. And John had got them tickets sitting behind the third base dugout, like right there in the corner. And he went down there as they were sitting down there in the 2nd or 3rd inning, and just like made this big deal about their Uncle Rick. So that was always.
like that.
I really liked that. That was really cool. They still tell me. I mean, those boys are 30-something years old,
And they still
They
remember the
always
story.
tell me that story. That's a great story. I remember that John called me up one day and he said, "Let's go look at the stadium." It was in the middle of construction, and I said, "Well, should I bring my dad?" He goes, "Absolutely, you gotta bring your dad." So I take my dad over there, and he's walking us all through the construction. We got hard hats on, and it's everything's great. Well, they hadn't put the seats in yet. And he goes, "Do you want to walk up to the top?" I was like, "Yeah." And my dad was like, I'll just sit here. I'm on the way here." So he and I hike all the way up to the top. All that's in there are the concrete slabs that are at an angle for where they put the seats, and then the little narrow 3-foot wide steps that go all the way up there. I get about halfway up there, and I'm a young man at that time, and I'm like starting to get vertigo. I'm like, there's nothing to hang on to. And he'd already done this 20 times probably that week. And by the time I get up to the top, I'm like turning around, sitting on my fanny, going down step by step. It was just like frightening, the elevation change of being at the top of that stadium with not a single seat or a handrail installed there. It was fantastic. That was a wonderful thing.
I know there's a science that goes into this. That was one of the things that I had heard, is that people wanted an intimate experience, and with that is a certain kind of elevation change and that takes place within the stadium. So it's.
I've been to, my son plays a lot of high school baseball and had done a lot of travel baseball in the summers, and so we go to states all over the western United States, and you can see HOK's presence everywhere across the country. It is, at the time we associated it with the stadium in Baltimore, the Baltimore Orioles, and here, but HOK does, high school in minor league stadiums all over the country, and you could go see their work. Kind of would show up in a place and it'd be like, wow, it's kind of, this has to be them. I mean, it just kind of has that signature look on it, and so that was kind of interesting. Those guys are great to work with. And then equally important to all this, and we can never lose sight of it, is it's not just the effort that people put in to getting Major League Baseball here, but it was the effort to make sure that once they were here, that we stuck to the deal with the voters in how we kind of administered and prosecuted their trust of this 20-year tax. And I don't know that anybody gets better credit for that than Ray Baker, whose leadership in that stadium district, which then transferred over to the football stadium as well, is I know that he had a lot of help from a lot of commissioners who were, on that stadium district, but there's no question that he maintained a level of accountability and transparency in how that contract with the voters was administered in the contract to the Colorado Rockies and subsequently to the Denver Broncos, that they were saving money, they were making fiscally responsible decisions, they were trying to get those bonds paid off early, and I don't think he'll probably ever get the credit that he deserves for the time and energy and skill and knowledge that he lent to Colorado in making Major League Baseball a success, because that stadium was a success and continues to be so.
Well, I think that's part of the reason Neil and I are doing this project, is that, what we know is maybe this much, and what really the story is probably this much, and that if it's going to be told, it needs to be told openly and fairly. And
well, a lot of people did a lot of good things.
right.
Sure.
At the right time.
You'll capture that as you complete this project. You're being very comprehensive about it.
I think one of the last things is that, when Neil brought me the concept of this, I mean, the thing that he talked about that captivated my imagination in addition to the economic impact was the community, family, social impact of it. And I know Sam Simplizio also talked about this being a big impact on our youth, because John was or Sam was running the JUCO tournament in Grand Junction. So, I mean, do you feel that and see that today, that, this is a gift that keeps on giving over time?
Baseball is such an American thing. I know they play it in other places and it's going to be an Olympic sport again, but it's an American thing, and so there's an element of that is neat that we get to share here, because we get to identify with our own people and our own guys and all of that. But at the same time, that's 1990. We get teams on the field by, is it 93?
93.
That they're playing over at Mile High Stadium.
Yep.
By 1994, by 2004, my son's now 5 years old. And he goes on to play baseball every summer till he gets into high school, and then he's playing like all winter, getting ready for it. He's playing in the spring with his school, he's playing in the summer with his. Baseball is such an element in our household that I liked baseball, but I wasn't. I mean, I remember the transistor radio in fourth grade listening to Baltimore Orioles because my dad was from Baltimore, and my uncle worked at a bank, and he handled the checking account for both the Baltimore Orioles and the Baltimore Colts when they were still in Baltimore. And so I would sit in class in fourth grade, and I'd have the transistor radio thing coming up the sleeve, and I'd be sitting in the back of the classroom, and I'd be listening to the game because they played them during the day.
Yeah.
You could get them on the radio, and it was while I as you say this, I'm now starting to remember that baseball was the Orioles were a big part of what was kind of going on. In things that I really liked and liked to do. It was a big thing for our family since my son's been in this, and it's just been a fantastic ride. And I got to take my dad to a World Series game in Denver, Colorado, while he was still alive, and still have that picture, and that was one of the greatest things ever. Ray Baker took that picture. He was sitting 4 rows behind us.
Oh, is that
That
right?
was so cool. And it's just, he's been to, I remember when, my son will always tell this story now, that the greatest Rockies game he ever went to was on opening day when he was in fourth grade. And we told him that he had a dentist appointment. And I called his teacher the day before, told him what was up. She was like, that's fine. She was a big baseball fan herself. And so I picked him up to go to the dentist appointment, and we're driving downtown over on 23rd. Of course, I'm looking for a parking spot, and he's looking around going, well, where's everybody going? I was like, oh, they're going to the baseball game. Today's opening day. Oh, I wish we were going to opening day. We find a place to park. He's like, well, where are we? This is the doctor's office over in Cherry Creek. Oh, well, he moved. He's over here. And so we get out of the car, and I open up the back, and I've got like hats and his baseball gloves. So I says, no, actually, we're not going to the dentist today. We're going to the baseball game. That was opening day, fourth grade. One of his greatest memories ever. I mean, I told that story, and it sounds like I took 3 or 4 minutes. He could take 20 minutes telling that story. He remembers every final detail, and it's. Those are magical moments. That's just kind of, I can't put a price tag on that, but it's a magical moment.
Which will probably be passed on to his kids and his grandkids. And
I'm sure it
whatever.
will.
You get a lot more magical moments with baseball than
You
you do with other
get a
sports.
lot of magical moments.
Because you have time to actually interact and do things, unlike a football game where it's so intense that only at halftime do you get to interact with the people you're with.
I can't live in and I've thought about this many times. I've lived at the house that I live in now for 30 years. We bought it. It's going to be 30 years in 2018. We bought it on May 16th of 1988. The only reason I remember that, it was election day for the airport campaign in Adams County, and I couldn't go to the closing. I had to sign a what do you call it?
Power of attorney.
Power of attorney to my wife, and she bought the house that we're still in.
Wow.
Because I was working on the campaign that day, and that was the day of the closing. And of course, we bought that house at the bottom of the market, and we've thought several times about, well, where we're going to live when we retire, where do we move, what do we do, and kids are gone, all that, and we think about places that you can live, and it's just very difficult for me to entertain a place that doesn't have a major league sports franchise in it. We're huge Bronco fans. We have season tickets. We're big Rockies fans. They just play too many games for us. If it was once a week for 16 weeks, I could do it. But 81 games in whatever is a little more challenging. But I've always made opening day since 1993. It's always an event in our office because Stratton has those tickets, and we always go. And we've been to some remarkable Nuggets games, even though we're not huge basketball fans. It's my daughter and I went through 9th and 10th grade going to hockey games, Avalanche games. We were there in 2001 for Joe Sakic. Leads these guys to like a 7-3 victory over the New Jersey Devils in Game 7 to win the Stanley Cup. it's one of her biggest memories. It's one of the greatest things that she can recall, and yet it happened. She was 11. And she
Well,
remembers it like it was yesterday.
It's amazing too. I mean, Neil and I will go to an opening day game and the streets in Lodo are just full. Or you go to a regular game and now that they've put in the party deck, it's so amazing. These people aren't even watching the baseball game, but it is the place to be. And it just make connections, I guess, with people. It's a different deal.
There's nobody 10 years younger than us or older who is still in the Denver metro area who says that's a regrettable decision. We probably shouldn't have done that. That penny sales tax was probably better spent on something else than even in our own pockets than doing that. It has paid itself over exponentially, not only in tangible measurements of economic development, but in the intangibles of just identity. My daughter, who now lives in Manhattan, she's 25, says, whenever I'm traveling and somebody says where you're from, I'm always proud to tell them that I'm from Denver because they always think that's a really cool place. They ask questions about it. Oh, Denver's really neat. It is Denver, Colorado on the map in 49 other states is an interesting place to other people. They like to hear about it. They think that's interesting versus when I tell them, well, I was like from Midland, Texas. That's kind of, okay. It doesn't seem to have the same weight.
All right.
Well, very
That's
good,
great.
Rick.
Thank you
Thanks
very
so
much,
much.
Rick.
That was just an
fabulous.
Glad to do it.
outstanding
That was
job.
fabulous.
Glad to
Yeah.
do it. Glad to help.